especially for Roman Catholics, this is a perfect book because this is written by a guy and his wife who come out of the traditional Catholic world. And so the book is basically comparing the two models of the church, the two paths, papal monarchy and collegiality. Now everybody knows that at Vatican II, collegiality became a buzzword, and it became this move to try to kind of reintegrate, right, the church into a collegial model and not just the Vatican I papal model. And that's for many reasons, but partly because of legitimate discoveries that were made in the last century pertaining to forgeries that had propped up the Vatican I mindset. It had to do with admitted facts relating to the limitations on jurisdiction for the Bishop of Rome in the first century, something that we covered in the last stream that makes up the Chieti document, the Chieti document covering the fact that the Bishop of Rome did not have universal jurisdiction in the first millennium, admitted in paragraph 19 of that document, signed off by Rome. And it's not all just everybody being factual and honest. There's also the element of ecumenism, which also has a lot of varying degrees of influences on the part of liberals. There's the geopolitical influence of ecumenism from powerful, wealthy families, the CIA, etc. So there's a lot of different reasons why Vatican II promoted the notion of collegiality. But I think one of the key takeaways is that the admission of collegiality is really a concession to the Orthodox argumentation for the last 1,000 years. And the admission that there's not this overwhelming amount of evidence in the first 1,000 years for the universal jurisdiction of the papacy view also backs up the Orthodox perspective. Because Dvorak was one of these Uniate scholars who basically vindicated, Mark of Ephesus, St. Photius, Palamos, all of these, Photius, right? The pillars of orthodoxy in the Uniate world, which basically allowed the papacy in the 20th century to cave to this and say, oh yes, by the way, all of these people who we considered as heretics for many centuries, they're all cool now, by the way. And so Dvorak's book is great for that. And all that did was kind of give me the impression that actually maybe we trads had been wrong. Because the trads really hate, the Orthodox stuff, right? And they're the ones that really don't want to admit any kind of resuscitation of Photius, Palamos, and Mark of Ephesus. And the logic is obvious. The trads at least understand that if those people can be resuscitated to become saints after being heretics for centuries, the founders of, quote, an entire schism of the East, then the Roman Catholic Church is no longer the true church because it has erred significantly for failing to understand that these great heresiarchs and schismatics were in fact, they were actually saints. And how contrary is this, of course, to Cantate Domino at the Council of Florence, which says that even if you die outside of communion with the Roman pontiff for the name of Christ as a martyr, you still go to hell. So the trads at least understand that it doesn't work unless it's a house of cards built on no contradictions. Welton begins the book by talking about he and his wife's experiences in the Vatican II church. The first catalyst for he and his wife to begin to question Roman Catholicism in the 70s and 80s was due to the liturgical reforms. And they pointed out, as I think anybody who had time in the Roman Catholic world knows, that the first thing that really irks you, especially if you convert from something else, like me going from Protestantism to Catholicism, you don't want to see hippie masses. You don't want to see hip-hop masses. You don't want to see puppet masses and clown masses, all of which are very common in the new rite of the Mass, the Novus Ordo Mass. And so he talks about all of those struggles that they had and how they had a hard time getting questions answered and how they had a hard time dealing with the just overwhelming prevalence of these insane liturgical abuses that in many cases go beyond Protestant and Anglican services, right? Even today, probably a lot of Protestant Anglican Episcopal services are more reverent than a lot of these wacko Novus Ordo clown masses. Not always, but in some cases. And so, he kind of talks about some of the traditional critiques that were very relevant of the new rite of the Mass, from the comparisons to Thomas Cranmer's reforms in the Anglican liturgy. So Cranmer wanted to get rid of a lot of things because he knew that lex orandi, lex credendi, right? The law of praying is the law of believing. So if you want to change the faith of the masses, the people, you change the liturgy. And so the alteration of the liturgy, Cranmer understood as the Archbishop of Canterbury under Henry VIII's schism. He knew that this would change the faith, and that comes to the fore in you probably heard of this book. I have this book, got it back when I was a trad, Cranmer's Godly Order, and all the trads like that book because it shows the alteration of the new Mass is a direct parallel to the alterations that Thomas Cranmer did to the Anglican liturgy. So you're literally doing an Anglican, not totally, but very, very similar patterns, right? And so he goes on to talk about that Monsignor Klaus Gamber, the liturgist and historian, Roman Catholic liturgist historian, talked about how there's the intentional desire on the part of the revisions of previous liturgies to get rid of the notion of sacrifice in the Eucharist, and to make it more like the Lord's Supper. And in fact, many Catholic historians and liturgists have pointed out how this is well known. There were many Lutheran and Anglican liturgical consultants at Vatican II helping to draw up the new Mass. So this is not conspiracy theory, it's very well known. And keep in mind, Vatican II is not optional for Roman Catholics. I have a whole video we did some months ago demonstrating that it's a total trad myth that Vatican II is optional, that you don't have to accept it. Vatican II is mandated in every church in the Roman Catholic world, and it's from the chair of Peter. It's been stated at least 4 times to be dogmatic and magisterial teaching, and the fact that Paul VI called it a pastoral council has absolutely nothing to do with whether you have the right to object to it or not, and you don't. Plus, there's 4 statements saying that it's dogmatic. Learn as he studied this perspective of the Orthodox Church to the first 1,000 years versus the Roman Catholic view. And so he talks about some of the first things that surprised him were to learn that, for instance, leavened bread for the Eucharist was also used by Rome for the first 800 years. Likewise, Rome practiced paedo communion all the way up until the 12th century. So these are clear alterations and innovations. Why would we not give communion to children? Makes no sense. And the entire early church does this. It's a universal norm in the church. And then he's pointing out that I started realizing that these are key alterations that I didn't even know about. Yeah, exactly. I didn't know that either when I was a trad. You learn these things over time. You realize, oh, actually, maybe we don't have it all figured out. And then he came upon quotes that really challenged the Roman Catholic notion of the papacy in, for example, St. Ignatius's famous quote, "Where the bishop is, there is the Catholic Church." And I'm paraphrasing the full quote. But there's another great quote that he mentions from Jerome, letter to Evangelus. And it shows that fullness of Catholicity, which according to Roman Catholicism, especially post-Vatican I, is really seen in the See of Rome alone. And not wherever the bishop is, the local bishop. And so that decentralized locality view, which is clearly expressed by St. Ignatius, no mention of where the bishop is in communion with Rome, there's the Catholic Church. No, where the bishop is, there's the Catholic Church. Jerome likewise says, it is not the case that there is a church in Rome and another one in the other parts of the world, Gaul, Britain, Africa, Persia, India. They all worship one Christ and they all observe one rule. If you ask for authority, the world outweighs its capital, Rome. The world of the bishops outweighs the authority of the Bishop of Rome. Wherever there is a bishop, whether it is in Rome or in Gubium, or whether it is Constantinople or Regium, or whether it is Alexandria or Zoan, this dignity and the priesthood is one. Neither is there any command of wealth, nor the lowliness of poverty that makes him a bishop or less a bishop. Every bishop is a successor to the apostle. There's no super bishop. Every bishop has the fullness of Catholicity. And that's from St. Jerome, whom, of course, Roman Catholics love to quote mine and take quotes out of context for. Also, he mentions the stage that many of us come to, which some of you might have even come to in the last week or two, where you heard me going through the canons of the councils. One thing I didn't cover, which is part of the canons of the councils, is the apostolic canons. And these are canons that date to the early 2nd, 3rd century, 4th century that eventually kind of gain acceptance throughout the church and are attached to some of the later councils, I think the 6th, Trullo, and the 7th. And the reason I didn't go into those is that the Roman Catholics kind of just hand wave those. They don't really care. But given the fact that they were widely accepted in many parts of the Eastern Church, and keep in mind, the majority of the church in the first 7 centuries is Eastern. It's not mainly in Rome. Most of the bishops, the seat of the empire, and most of the people speak Greek because the Eastern Church is the largest, most prominent church, not Rome. Rome had a primacy of age and honor. But some of the other churches had age too, like Alexandria or Antioch. The witness of tradition is that there is only one, and that is me, according to Pius IX. So this is a famous quote from Pope Pius IX in terms of his view of the papacy and how it is the embodiment and judge of tradition. And that is, in fact, the opposite of what we see, for example, in, as I said, the apostolic canons, which Canon 34 reads, "The bishop of every nation must acknowledge who is first among them and account him as their head, and do nothing of consequence without that consent. But each may do those things which concern his own parish and the country places which belong to it. But neither let him who is first do anything without the consent of all, for so there will be a unity of mind, and God will be glorified through the Lord and in the Spirit." And so we see that there's nothing about the Bishop of Rome having this supremacy. In fact, that's spoken to all of the bishops anywhere in the world. And he mentions an important encyclical from Pius IX, which of course would be relevant to uniates or people that think that they can reject Vatican I. Pius IX, the Pope of Vatican I, wrote an encyclical called Lux Veritatis, and it's about the schismatic Easterns, or the Orthodox Church, the separated Easterns. And what's funny about it is that it makes a lot of appeals and arguments to, again, things that are admitted to be forgeries. For example, there's forged quotes from Cyril that nobody accepts anymore in regard to Ephesus. And then it also, kind of going along with Satis Cognitum and what's in Vatican I, it has this idea that everybody at all times always believed this. So remember, it's not just Vatican I, it's also Satis Cognitum, it's also Pius IX, that say that the Petrine supremacy doctrine is not something that evolved. Now, I say that because many Roman Catholics default to Cardinal Newman's argument that the papal doctrine evolves. It's a seed, it grows into a tree. And they have to do that precisely because of the lack of evidence for this position in the first 1,000 years, and because of the wealth of contrary evidence that contradicts the notion of universal jurisdiction and supremacy. And so they will retreat to the opposite argument that modernists make, ironically, that doctrine evolves, it develops, and so the papacy is the thing that was in a seed form in the first 1,000 years of the church, and then it becomes a tree by our day, thus Vatican I is so late. Now, just think of the absurdity of this. The foundational doctrine of how we know where the true church is literally like the last council, right? Except for Vatican II, right? Wouldn't that have been the first council? Wouldn't this have been in the creed? There's nothing about Peter, nothing about the chair of Rome in the creed, and yet the creed is supposed to identify the marks of the church. So it identifies the marks of the church with nothing, without anything to say about the See of Rome. And by the way, the creed that the church uses is produced at Constantinople I, which is the council called and convened and had out of communion with Rome. So this is just ludicrous, right, when we know our history here. Now, again, I like the fact that Welton stresses the fact that if you really want to be a traditional Catholic, you can't argue that the papacy developed. Okay, the universal supremacy jurisdiction doctrine is not a development. In fact, Vatican I and Setis Cognitum explicitly exclude the theory that the papacy is a gradual development. And Welton stresses that, which is an argument you hear me stress a lot as well, because it points out the contradiction in Roman Catholic apologetics, because half of them, and some of them will even say both, they'll contradict in the same debate. They'll say the same contradictory thing, that it was always there, but it wasn't always there and evolved. So both of these things can't be true at the same time. But, Roman Catholic apologists are not known for clear-headed logical thinking. Now, I like that he just kind of dives in and starts to treat some of the kind of classic clickbaity quote mines that we hear, right? The famous "Rome is spoken, the case is closed." And this is a classic quote mine that is easily demonstrably false, because when St. Augustine is talking about that, he's not talking about the fact that the case is closed because the Bishop of Rome unilaterally spoke. It's actually, he's stating that 2 African councils rendered a judgment against the Pelagians, and then those judgments were sent to Rome, and then Rome agreed. And so St. Augustine is saying that the collegial attitude of the church, all of us, right, have consented to this, and the case is closed. So it's not this unilateral quote that everybody just sent the question to Rome, and Rome answered the question, and the case is closed. So, and that's how every Roman Catholic interprets this stupid thing, right? Totally out of context. And in fact, what they forget is that Pope Zosimus actually restored Pelagius. And Augustine and the African churches did not hesitate to vigorously oppose him by calling a council at Carthage where Pelagius was anathematized. So Augustine and the African synods are actually operating in rebellion to the fact that Pope Zosimus erroneously for a time restored Pelagius. Eventually, Pope Zosimus backed down from this and issued his own condemnation of Pelagius. Catholic scholars have uncovered this error 100 years ago. Thus, Catholic historians like Warren Carroll are in full concurrence. So they mention this, they're aware of this. He gives citations about this. Thus, the popular mythical remark, "Rome has spoken, the case is closed," is not a neat, concisive, and conclusive statement of papal infallibility and supreme jurisdiction. St. Augustine had ample opportunity throughout his works, his voluminous works, to express anything remotely close to the notion of universal jurisdiction for the Bishop of Rome, and yet there's nothing like this. There's mention of apostolic sees, there's mention of all of the sees, and in fact, there is Rome's supreme authority is not a single word. It should be mentioned that when St. Augustine refers to Rome as the apostolic see, he is not referring to it having any special power or authority or title. Quote, "The Christian society is diffused by the propagation over all of the world by the apostolic sees and the bishops who are in them." And then it goes on to note that, as with the fathers of the early church, St. Augustine recognized that general councils have the highest level of authority. In the dispute with the Donatists about baptism, he does not condemn Cyprian for refusing to simply submit to Pope Stephen of Rome. And if you know that controversy, there's a controversy between Bishop Stephen of Rome and Cyprian very early on over a question about baptism. And Cyprian disagreed. Now, ultimately, Cyprian was was wrong, right? The church eventually sided with Pope Stephen. But the point is that, number one, Cyprian didn't believe that he had no ability to correct the Bishop of Rome. And St. Augustine does not fault St. Cyprian, who was in error, for disagreeing with and arguing with the Bishop of Rome, which he would have done if St. Augustine believed in papal supremacy, which was the whole point of the out of context "Rome has spoken" quote. So in other words, they'll take the quote line, ignore everything else in the people's lives, all the rest of their letters and writings, which don't give any credence and in fact contradict this idea, but they don't care because here's a quote that says "Rome has spoken, the case is closed." And you'll notice that just like Protestants in their quote mines to prove whatever their pet doctrine is, Roman Catholics do the exact same thing when it comes to papal supremacy. The First Ecumenical Council, Nicaea's canon. Then he mentions the Second Ecumenical Council, which we just covered in the last stream, so I'm not going to recover all that. That it was called out of communion with the Pope, convened, closed, out of communion with the Pope, basically ratified the Trinity, the most important doctrine for the Church, and it is not the Augustinian model of the Trinity that it ratifies. It is the Cappadocian model of the Trinity at Constantinople I. And it is presided over by Saint Meletius, who is a saint in the Roman Catholic Church who died out of communion with Rome. So again, multiple levels of contradiction, so we won't go into that, which I've already covered that on a previous stream.